Frigid Siberian prison camps, coasts where you might get plucked up and enslaved, cities besieged for years, entire continents wiped out by a combination of bigotry and disease. There have been some pretty bad places to live throughout the course of history. Here are some you may not have been aware of, and others that are still worthy of talking about. I hope you're somewhere safe watching Nutty History. Siberian exile. On December 22, 1849, Fyodor Dostoevsky and 34 other members of a group of intellectuals and revolutionaries were taken to Semyonov Square in St. Petersburg, Russia. It was a frigid winter day, and Dostoevsky was about to meet his maker, or so he thought. He was escorted up to a pole stuck in the ground. In front of it was a grave dug just for him. An officer tied him to the pole. The last thing he probably saw before a bag was slipped over his head was the firing squad lined up in front of him, behind the grave where his body would go. He waited, and then nothing.
It was a mock execution. Tsar Nicholas I had pardoned the group the day before. It was a part of his terror tactics. Make these potential revolutionaries thankful that he spared their lives, or at least soiled their pants a little. Dostoevsky was one of Russia's most acclaimed novelists. He was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in a Siberian prison camp, and he wrote a semi-autobiographical novel called House of the Dead from his experiences there, and it wasn't a pretty life.
Conditions in the camp were horrible. There was overcrowding and disease. Workers were forced down into treacherous mines or into forest in the dead of winter to chop wood for lumber or had to construct roads. If they succumbed to the cold, their bodies were often simply tossed to the side of the roads they were working on and forgotten. 2 years earlier, in 1847, Tsar Nicholas had enacted penal laws that kicked off a huge exodus of potential usurpers, revolutionaries, intellectuals who questioned the monarchy, petty criminals, and pretty much anyone who did anything that bothered the leaders of Russia, and that included cheating on your spouse or begging in the street. By the end of the century, nearly 1 million people would be sent into the remote, desolate, dangerous, and definitely cold landscape of Siberia. The year 536.
If you lived in the year 536, there wasn't really a worse place to live. Nearly everywhere was bad. Historian Michael McCormick believes that 536 AD was the worst time to be alive in history. Worse than the Black Death that hit Europe in the 1300s and cut the population in half. Worse than in 1918 when the Spanish flu took out nearly 100 million people. You may think we have it bad now if you watch the news, but wait until you hear about some of the stuff that went down just after the fall of Rome.
In 536, there was a giant volcanic eruption, maybe in Iceland or North America, though the exact location is still up for debate. It spewed a massive amount of ash up into the atmosphere, which ended up enveloping pretty much the entire northern hemisphere and blocking out most of the sunlight. North America, Europe, and most of Eurasia basically went dark. This cooled the planet down and created all kinds of environmental chaos. Temperatures dropped and kicked off the coldest decade in over 2,300 years. The cooling temperatures caused crop failures, which led to widespread famine. Historical records from the period describe a dry fog that shrouded the skies, a phenomenon that was probably a result of all that volcanic ash blocking the sunlight. While it's pretty difficult to pinpoint the exact death toll caused by the volcanic clouds and the crop failures and famines it induced, the sheer scale of it kind of makes your head spin. Everyone was starving. Native Americans, Europeans, Chinese, Eurasians. It was a calamity of global proportions. With famine and economic collapse, there is inevitably warfare as society breaks down. So when you take that into account, things become even more bleak.
Just a few years later, in 541 AD, the Justinian plague hit. It's thought that it was caused by the same bacterium that later caused the bubonic plague. This one took out nearly 25 to 50 million people. Now, given that the entire world population at the time was somewhere between 150 and 200 million people, you're looking at a quarter to a third of everyone on Earth taken out by that little bacterium.
Add on to that number all the chaos and violence that was going on in the aftermath of the fall of Rome, including the devastating Gothic War that started in 535, and most likely well over half the world's population perished. Think about that. Certainly not the greatest time to be alive. Siege of Sarajevo.
To say that Sarajevo wasn't a great place to live between April 1992 and February 1996 is one of the biggest understatements in the history of statements. During the Bosnian War, ethnic Serbs who were Christian lay siege to Sarajevo, inhabited by Bosniaks, ethnic Muslims. During their nearly 4-year siege, more than 11,000 people lost their lives, almost half of which were civilians. An average of 329 mortar shells were fired on the city each day, and 500,000 bombs in total descended on residents over the course of the siege. Oh yeah, and there were snipers positioned all over the place, so even if there was a brief bombing intermission, there was a good chance you could be picked off while going over to visit your mom's house.
Despite all this, stories of resilience and bravery were almost as frequent as the mortar shells fired during the siege. The people locked up in the city, being bombarded by all kinds of things that could kill them at any time of the day or night, refused to let their desperate situation get the best of them. One of those people was a musician named Vedran Smilovic, known as the cellist of Sarajevo. Dressed in formal concert attire, Smilovic performed Albinoni's Adagio in G minor in the ruined square of a marketplace in downtown Sarajevo. A mortar round, one of 329 per day, had destroyed the square, killing 22 people who were there looking to buy some food. He went there every day at 4 p.m. and played his cello for 22 days to honor the 22 victims, the whole time in danger of being shelled himself or getting hit by snipers. Smilovic managed to escape the besieged city towards the end of 1993. Little did he know the siege would go on for another 2 years. The details of how he did it aren't very clear, but it's possible he could have escaped via a secret tunnel. The Tunnel of Hope, as it's been nicknamed, was dug under the Sarajevo airport during the early stages of the siege and was finished by June 1993. It was Sarajevo's lifeline to the outside world and allowed food, medicine, weapons, and people in and out of the besieged city. The tunnel itself was half a mile long and dug by the citizens themselves. They worked on it 24 hours a day, alternating 8-hour shifts to complete it in just 70 days.
One of the strangest acts of defiance during the siege was a beauty pageant. The Miss Besieged Sarajevo beauty pageant was organized in 1993 amidst the horrors of the siege. It took place in the basement of Sarajevo's Holiday Inn of all places. The hotel was right on a street called Sniper Alley, which, as the name suggests, was not the safest street to walk down in Sarajevo.
But despite the dangers, the pageant went off without a hitch. Because of a lack of supplies, some contestants rigged up dresses and outfits with materials like refurbished parachutes or old pieces of clothing. Fashion was actually a powerful symbol of resistance for the women of Sarajevo during the siege. One of the most iconic images of the entire Bosnian War was this one of Malaya Verashanovic, also known as Sarajevo's Sophia Loren, walking defiantly past a soldier against a backdrop of sandbags. During the pageant, contestants lined up with a banner with the words "Don't let them kill us" written across it. A few journalists made it past Sniper Alley to cover the event, and a documentary was even made about it. The winner of Miss Besieged Sarajevo, Anela Nogic, even made it onto the cover of a U2 single titled Miss Sarajevo that came out in 1995. Aztec Sacrifice.
Over the course of 4 days in 1487, blood poured down from the Templo Mayor in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. During the 4-day rededication ceremony for the Great Pyramid, somewhere between 10,000 and 80,000 people were sacrificed. Here's what it might have been like witnessing the horrible yet ritualistic spectacle.
Templo Mayor was a massive pyramid with twin temples at the top, one dedicated to the god of war, Huitzilopochtli, and the other to the god of rain and agriculture, Tlaloc. The temple was the very core of religious and political life of the Aztecs, by far their most important structure. The ceremony was attended by a massive group of people that included the Aztecs, as well as representatives and dignitaries from allied tribes. They danced, they listened to music, they feasted, and then hearts and bodies rolled down the stairs of the pyramid. The sacrificial victims who were more likely than not prisoners of war, were led in a procession up the steps of the pyramid. They wore clothes woven with the images of the gods they were about to be sacrificed to. The line of victims probably stretched on, down the street and around the corner, if you will. Once they were at the top of the pyramid, each victim was met by a group of priests dressed in all kinds of elaborate clothing and feathers. There was a head priest and a group of assistants who helped hold each soon-to-be sacrificed down on a stone altar. The chief priest then used an obsidian blade, sharp, black, and glassy, to make a quick cut just below the ribcage and pull out the still beating heart. After taking out the heart, the body was pushed down the stairs of the temple. Yeah, some pretty bad stuff. At the base, other priests may have carried out additional rituals. Skulls were eventually added to the Tampatli, a massive skull rack on display near the temple.
This bloody ritualistic cycle was repeated thousands of times over the course of 4 days. The priest worked around the clock to make sure enough people were continuously being sacrificed in order to appease the gods and make sure the sun continued to rise each morning.
It was a gory scene for sure, but it probably wasn't as bad as the high estimates of 80,000 victims. In order to sacrifice that many people in the span of 4 days, there would have had to have been 15 sacrifices per minute. The number was most likely an exaggeration by the Spanish, who were part of a much wider horror show that was the European colonization of the Americas. Partition of India.
In August 1947, one of the largest migrations in human history took place. After 300 years of colonial rule, the British said bye-bye and left India. The last Viceroy of British India, Louis Mountbatten, figured it would be a good idea to separate the Hindus from the Muslims, so he proposed a partition plan that would carve out Pakistan as a separate nation for Muslims, leaving a mostly Hindu India. Then a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe drew a line across northwest India, creating Pakistan, and then he hopped on a luxurious ship and went back to England.
The result of that line was devastating. 10 to 15 million people scrambled to move over into their respective regions based on their religions. Between 5 and 10 million people would die from sectarian violence when it was all said and done. Violence erupted all over the border region. One of the most horrific series of events were the so-called death trains. Trains carrying refugees were often targeted by mobs on both sides, and the results were deadly. It wasn't common for trains to reach their destination filled with corpses. 2 such incidents stand out amidst all the chaos and brutality that was unfolding. The first happened near Amritsar, near the partition border. On September 22nd, a mob of Sikhs and Hindus rushed a train as it was carrying thousands of Muslims west, towards newly formed Pakistan. In broad daylight, the train was basically ripped apart. People were dragged out of the train and killed. No one was spared. It was bad. In the end, around 3,000 people lost their lives, and the train reportedly chugged on, arriving at the next station in shambles.
Then, 2 days later, a Muslim group took out their frustrations on a train filled with Hindus and Sikhs at a station at Kamoki, Pakistan. Based on which side of the partition you were on, estimates of casualties varied. Pakistani officials put the number around 400 or 500. Indian officials said that nearly all of the 3,500 people packed onto the train lost their lives.
The partition of India was one of the worst disasters in history, one that could have absolutely been avoided, and a sad example of the tragedy caused by an imaginary line with an influence that becomes all too real. Mao's Revolution.
China in the late 1950s and early 1960s was a land of famine and persecution, the scale of which has rarely been rivaled in history. Chairman Mao's great leap forward was really a huge step backward, multiple giant, massive steps backward actually. The plan was to industrialize the country, to shift it from an agrarian society to a modern one. Farming was collectivized and industries were developed at breakneck speed.
Local officials who were under too much pressure to meet the central government's pipe dream production targets started fudging the numbers. They'd grossly exaggerate the amount food farms were producing in their reports. The fudged numbers rose up through the ranks, making everyone in charge think everything was going great, when in reality, it really wasn't. Based on these inflated figures, the Chinese government continued to export rice to other countries, assuming that there was still enough left to feed the people within China. But there wasn't. Despite reports that there was still a surplus, millions were starving. The famine was one of the deadliest in history. Estimates put the death toll somewhere between 15 and 45 million. But a lot of people lost their lives not to starvation, but because of the political violence that followed.
Mao's Cultural Revolution, which lasted for a decade between 1966 and 1976, was a campaign against what he called the 4 O's: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. This campaign targeted anyone the government saw as a potential threat to their communist ideology. All kinds of people were targeted: intellectuals, politicians, random people on the street wearing glasses, which was a real thing, and apparently a sign that you were reading books the government didn't like.
And if you weren't sent to a prison camp or killed, you might be subjected to something called a struggle session, also known as a denunciation rally. If you were deemed to be anti-communist or not communist enough, you might be accosted at your workplace or on the street by a mob of people. While it might have seemed random, it really wasn't. You knew these people. They were your co-workers and friends and family members who turned against you thanks to a bit of government persuasion and propaganda. European colonization of the Americas.
When the Spanish arrived in Mexico, things fell apart quickly and horrifyingly for the Aztecs. Pre-Columbus, Tenochtitlan alone was estimated to hold nearly 250,000 people. The empire, including all the tribute states, had a total population between 4 and 7 million. By the time the conquistadors finished tearing through the region, a whopping 90% of those people had perished, mostly from diseases brought over from Europe.
And it wasn't much better for people in the rest of the so-called New World. There were about 37 million people in Mexico, Central and South America before the Spanish arrived. By 1650, there were 9 million. More than 75% of all the inhabitants of an entire continent had perished. In what's now the U.S. and Canada, there were somewhere between 3 and 18 million Native Americans. The estimates there vary pretty widely, but by the late 1800s, there were about 250,000. The scope of the loss of life on both continents is honestly hard to grasp. While there were plenty of places and times across North and South America where and when you wouldn't want to live, one of them is a bit more obscure and less talked about, but no less horrible. Before the Spanish arrived, the Inca had a labor tax called the mita. All able-bodied citizens of the empire had to work on building or agricultural projects for a certain number of days per year. When the conquistadors came through and toppled the empire and took control, they exploited this system in a bad way, particularly under Peruvian Viceroy Francisco de Toledo between 1569 and 1581. Toledo forced every community across the empire to send 1/7 of their workforce to go work in all the gold and silver mines popping up. The Spanish were mining more than the Inca ever had. Now, instead of the traditional mita, where families would send one of their young men to go help build a road or terrace, they were forced into one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. The conditions in the mines were horrible. Inhaling all that stone dust and fatal accidents from collapses and falls contributed to the deaths of millions. And the practice didn't stop until the 1800s. Disease and violence certainly tore apart the fabric of Inca communities, and the forced mining mita system added yet another devastating blow to the assault that was the European colonization of the Americas.
Thanks for watching. What other places or eras do you want to learn about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.